So welcome, Dolly.
Thank you.
You are speaking here today at the water cooler.
Yes.
So let's have a chat. Obviously, I would keep saying to people, everyone here is lucky enough to see it, but then all the people on the water cooler channels and the RAN channels and the working well community channels, they won't know.
Yes.
So what are you here talking about today? So it's about the link between food, nutrition, and workplace well-being. Is that what I got?
Yeah. It's an interesting one because my background is very much focused on the government policy side. So why has government policy on food-related ill health and health in general failed over the last 30 years? Because we're in a worse situation than we were, especially when it comes to food-related ill health. And there are huge implications for employees, and we're knowing that is becoming really high on the agenda of even government. Government's suddenly going, we've got this crisis of, economic productivity and out of work, inactivity, all that kind of stuff. And so what should they be doing and what should employers be doing? And it's really interesting looking back at what the government has proposed for employers, because it's not necessarily the level that I imagine people would expect.
And that's really interesting because that's one of the themes that's run through a few of the conversations I've been having here in the pod. Particularly the efforts to tackle the growing trend, ever-growing trend of economic inactivity. But actually, this is not one of the. It is a big piece of the puzzle, clearly. But it wasn't where many of the conversations I've been having are focused. They were mainly around the classic sort of psychosocial risk factors, and the health and wellbeing strategy overall for organisations, and how that is or isn't supported by government. So I'm really interested in this perspective. And what are you? What are you seeing in the numbers? Is it tracking the kind of psychosocial risk factors with, the increase in obesity, for example, or, the health outcomes that are related to poor nutrition and poor diet?
Yeah, we're seeing huge rises in lots of conditions that are meaning people are out of work or they're in work and less productive. They're taking more sick days. Obesity is one of many conditions that have those kind of statistics going up. And it raises all sorts of questions about what the drivers are of that. What is causing that? Why is it getting worse over the last 30 years? And one of the big issues, which is one of my main areas of focus, is our food system and the fact that diets are driving so many of these problems. And really, they're linked to basically all the problems, even the mental health issues that might be seen as more separate and maybe driven by other things. There are absolutely strong relationships between our diets and those issues and musculoskeletal problems and lots of things that we're now seeing the Treasury and the Office for Budget Responsibility concerned and raising flags about these numbers going up, and raising the question of what should be done and who should be responsible. And I think that's where the interesting thing comes to employers, because there's a huge responsibility kind of being put on employers and questions being asked, what are you doing and what are you doing in your workplace? What are you doing for your employees? But we live in this wider system that's making it incredibly difficult for all of us to live a healthy life. And that's where my interest is, where the government plays a role at that very, very top level.
Yeah, because it's a bit similar to kind of where I've spent my working life working with organisations on health and wellbeing strategy, on measuring health and wellbeing.
Yeah.
But if you think about the basis of measuring overall health and wellbeing, whether that be pressures at work or business level outcomes, psychological health, whatever, that can be done really, really well and lead to amazing data that you can work with, or it can be done as a kind of tick box. And I imagine the tick box version of in your world is healthy eating in the canteen tick. That goes so far. No one's saying that's a bad thing, but it presumably, if it's implemented in a particular way in a particular culture, it's kind of like, well, okay, but that's not going to create their outcomes. What are you seeing, like big variations in terms of what employers, their attitude towards this, I guess, and how they their take on it is in terms of what they actually end up rolling out.
Well, it's an interesting question because it's the question that I'm bringing to this event, and I'm really interested to see what employees are, doing, and yeah, totally, and what programs they're introducing and how they're kind of monitoring success. I mean, the problem with the sort of whole system in a way is that there isn't really a standardized version for employees to follow. So we don't have basically any rules really in place that are mandated for employers around food or, these kind of health giving opportunities. And so you basically get a lack of implementation, or you get very different ideas about what should be done, which has its benefits obviously as well, of kind of, you can say that that's a more tailored approach, etc., and the employees may know what's best for their business, but you also measure success in very different ways, and so you have this really difficult situation of basically not ever being able to quite answer that question until you have standardized approaches to measuring.
So measuring, so someone could be looking at absence, for example. Somebody could be looking at actual health figures, or use of support services or whatever. And it's difficult.
What should be the case? Should be government? These are all kind of big, more maybe ideological questions about the role of government. But should government be coming in and going, we think employers, this is so important. They have to be doing this, and this is the way that we're going to monitor it. And you look at a country like Japan, for example, and they've got the Metabo law, where they you get fined as an employer if you've got a certain number of people over a weight. And so if you've got a certain proportion of your employees that are living with obesity, you get a fine as an employer. So that defines
the reporting then?
Absolutely. So that's one of the measures that they've introduced, but they're very, very stringent when it comes to food, for example, served in schools, which is a different place, but it shows the sort of, the sort of interventions that a government could possibly be thinking about. And we do have, in many ways, the frameworks to do that. So we do have public food procurement, and we've got standards around that. Some are mandatory, some are voluntary. So we also have a problem with that same issue of, difference and different levels of compliance. And even when they're mandatory, for example, with schools, only 1 in 4 schools complies with the National School Food Standards, so you've still got difficulties even when it's mandatory. But there are ways that government and employers can work together to create a healthier environment. But food is one aspect of it, and people are living very, very stressful lives and working incredibly long hours and coping. That is a whole range of things that need to be done, and big questions about our economic structures.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Loads of links to conversations that I've been having this week. I feel like I'm in Keep Britain Working Charlie Mayfield world this week, because I've been at an event with him and with Dame Carol Black was there, and But I was asking her yesterday about this issue and like what's missing, and what organisations are likely to have to do, or whatever, or the gap that needs to be closed as a result of this review when it eventually comes and has recommendations. And it's funny because it really links with what you were saying. The conclusion that we were reaching was that it was about consistency of practice. So like, there's a lot of great stuff has been done in organisations in the UK and more broadly, and if you like the level, I always like to use that language of maturity. So maturity is very commonly used in health and safety world, but less so in health and well-being, but actually really applies. And as you get more mature as an organisation, your practice becomes more consistent and more embedded, and I think. And also the practice across organisations. If you mature as a country in terms of how your organisations deal with this and how the legislation supports that, then again your maturity your practice is consistent across organisations. And I think what Carol was saying was that loads of progress has been made, but there's still absolutely massive variability.
Yes, and inconsistency
between organisations. What one organisation sees as a successful set of outcomes, broader than food and nutrition, but including them. What one organisation sees as a set of outcomes that denotes what good looks like is really different to another one. Different starting points. Some are focused on the more strategic measurement approach. Some are working on the to personal development, line managers, leaders, whatever, and some are very policy based. So I think it's that what she was really saying was that the next step is that consistency, and what that probably means is a common code of practice and a common set of measurements, and that would kind of encompass some of the stuff
But we are so far from it. It's amazing. I mean, even looking at employer-specific policies that the government has published over the last 30 years, I was sort of mind blown by the ambiguity of the policies. You know, we're talking about statements like we will start, these are in government strategies, we will start a conversation. Reviewed. I did an analysis of all government obesity policies over the last 30 years, because I was like, how is it that I keep hearing these announcements of policies, you know, we're going to fix this problem and we see that it's an issue and da-da-da. And yet there was nothing, I couldn't see anything changing. I couldn't see things getting better. And so I wanted to do this full analysis to understand what had been proposed and to try and figure out why that wasn't translating into the kind of change. And basically what I discovered is that the government has published almost 700 individual policies to tackle obesity and food-related ill health in the last
30 years. That's a lot of reading.
And yet no reduction in obesity prevalence or related health inequalities in that time. And looking specifically at the policies proposed for employees, it's literally statements like, we will start a conversation with employers about what they can do. And you're like, what does that mean?
And if you're looking at it over 30 years, you would hope to see that the conversation somewhere has been started.
And they're reviewing that conversation and, you know, they're saying what it led to. Absolutely not. You get the repeat of those kind of statements, very, very ambiguous statements, repeated over the years. So there is an issue with that as well. And then it's about the kind of what kind of standardization do we want? And we hear from, when we're talking about regulations of industries that are health harming, so the food industry, at the sort of corporate level, alcohol industry, tobacco industry, that kind of thing. You often hear people saying that we need a level playing field, which is about, you know, having government regulation for that. And it kind of sits in this territory of going, even for employers, I'm sure there's a level of going a level playing field would help, you know, and there's an aspect.
Standards,
Totally, but it has to come with the investment and support network that enables, you know, companies to see through those policies, whatever they may be. And I think that's where the challenge comes for policymakers, because we did this report. This is Henry Dimbleby and my report that we published last year, Nourishing Britain, where because of that analysis I did of all government policies, we sort of decided to go to the politicians who'd been in the highest positions over the last 30 years. So prime ministers, health secretaries, other relevant ministers. We've interviewed former chancellors, current mayors and former mayors, you name it, about why the politics are so hard, why they couldn't just do these, you know, big policies, why they can't just change things. And it was fascinating. And one of the issues is around that consistency and around the sort of difficulty of going, I don't want to be seen to be telling, you know, people or companies what to be doing and imposing on that, rather than seeing it as going, we're actually enhancing individuals and companies to kind of be the best that they can be. So interesting, reframing.
Really interesting. I'm also thinking, like, why is it possible in an area like, for example, you know, psychosocial risk that, you know, for good or bad, you know, in terms of what they are and how well they were implemented, something like the HSE management standards for stress, essentially stress risk factors. That is mandated and inspected by the HSE. And that was, I don't know when that was, probably 2005, something like 2006. But that there was a conduit for it, right? So it wasn't just the government policy and you know, this is now what we are telling as a government. It went through the HSE, which was a standards-based body that had enforcement powers, however lightly they use it. But actually, even in the last few years, there's been, you know, murmurings about the enforcement of the management standards, and the fact you have to have assessed for them is strengthening, fines sitting behind it and stuff like that. Now, I know, you know, obviously this stuff is carrot and stick, right? It's not all stick, but I'm really surprised that there's not a you know, a route like that where a set of standards could during that whole period. It's not like we're just saying do it now. During that whole period where something enforceable. But you know, the reason I mention the management standards is because that's the stick side of it. But because of you know, like the idea of the concept of equivalence
Yes.
with it. It's quite permissive. So, you know, the company I work for used to have a set of things called the 6 Essentials, which was essentially a slightly more developed, with better norms version
took it
of
on.
what the management standard did.
Yeah.
And that was they created a marketplace,
Yeah.
and it was often, if an organisation came and did that, and then the HSE came to look at them, they'd go fine because it's equivalent, and it was constructive in that way, because yes, there was the stick behind it, but it created a marketplace, and people bought into it because they realised it solved a problem. And once the kind of narrative of, you know, around health and well-being went from being defensive, let's not get taken to a tribunal for a stress claim, to actually this is a positive driver of business performance, then everyone was, well, of course we need to measure these things. And I hear you talking about this sort of thing, and I think, well,
it sits on that defensive at the moment, and
needs flipping.
Yes, it needs flipping. It needs flipping. But health, you know, again, something that we saw in this report is that health is obviously a huge agenda in the government, budget-wise and, you know, political capacity-wise, but it's absolutely subsumed by the NHS and kind of waiting lists and these immediate, you know, hospital building, all that kind of stuff. And so public health and prevention and sort of health creation, creating a kind of thriving, flourishing environment for people to operate in is just so small. And even within that, as you're saying, even employers are choosing between, you know, is it the mental health route that they're focusing on, or food or whatever, and it's all seen as these separate things. There almost is this lack, this finite political capacity, which I imagine is the same as sort of business capacity, employer capacity, to sort of think about all of these things. Whereas if you are a health focused first employer who sees the economic benefits of that model of having thriving people coming in, not stressed, you know, productive and living amazing lives.
And even better if you're in a health culture. Nationally.
Totally, and it totally, and that's where the sort of external system. So it's really difficult, because I look around our world in the UK, and we're one of the leaders in the world of consuming ultra-processed food, as an example. And we are really exceptional when it comes to to our European neighbours, for example. We're sort of double, if sometimes not more than double, the rate of consumption of ultra-processed food. And I'm like, why? Why is that? And there are so many reasons, and it's really interesting how much it links to the economic situation that we've created, where, you know, we work people bloody hard. You know, we have huge inequality. You know, all of the sort of, when I look through the lens of food, it is a justice, equality, pay, economic, you know, all these other issues, mental health, you name it. It kind of encapsulates a lot of these social drivers. So I think it's I'd love to hear government talking in a way where they understand that, and they understand the barriers that employers face, because we're all operating within the system. And if they're talking about going, we're not quite setting anyone up to live their best life, you know.
And defining the borders between the intersections between, well, because, you know, employees have a responsibility as well, right? So it's about site contract with the employer, but also site contract between the employee and the state, and then the relationship between, it's a tripartite thing, isn't it? Like, and then relationship between the employer organisations and the state as well.
Yeah.
That is very ill-defined, I feel, and it definitely seems to me that, I mean, keep coming back to the Keep Britain Working stuff. I mean, that is at stake, you know, that what that relationship is, and how what's being asked of employers, how much emphasis is on employees to fund or behave in a way that is complementary to kind of ending up on long-term sick or disability benefit. So it is a very complex relationship. But it would seem to me like, I mean, obviously, before we finish, I want to ask you about like what are your hopes for this, and where do you think it's going? Something like the Keep Britain Working piece, I would have thought this is right in the middle of that, in terms of this would, if it worked, if it went anywhere, this would be one of the key topics that would have the potential to positively affect the rates of economic inactivity.
Totally.
And in those populations that it's going to be focused on, or all populations. Do you see that as a vehicle, or is it coming from somewhere else, do you think?
No, I think it totally needs to be pitched in that way and thought about in that way. Health needs to be seen as central to any economic programme. And unfortunately, the language is slightly out of kilter, so it's kind of economic growth first and health. If it can have an economic growth angle to it, then we'll sort of shoehorn it in rather than seeing it as completely part of the same thing. And it's really interesting the fact that the Treasury and the Office for Budget Responsibility have started to speak out on this and publish, concerns around this and started to prioritise it. We saw that within 2023, 2024, this agenda, health and, workplace productivity, inactivity, you name it, was absolutely on the Treasury agenda. But the problem that I find is it still defaults to going, can we just use weight loss jabs or, these very sort of quick fix rather than going, how are we setting people up economically, to kind of operate, whether it's, house prices or working hours or pay or, there's so many factors that can affect it.
I mean, you must have come across this kind of with your politics head on. You must have come across this as really any sort of, a lot of the countries that people go to look at as model. You mentioned Japan, but I know that they've looked at the Netherlands, Denmark for this review, for example. Yeah. And they these are 10, 15-year strategies, right? That are because of their coalition-based governments. Very interesting. Are made possible. Yeah. But in reality, our timeline, by the time the government's got in and started to do some stuff, you're talking 3 years to take enough action and create enough impact to make it compelling for the next government, so they couldn't put it down, whoever that's going to be. And I can't help but feel that is really, almost like an impossible equation. How can you create what they've created in 15 years of consistent action in different countries based on a 3-year horizon?
If that.
If that.
Well, I mean, that was one of the biggest findings from here. It was so interesting how many people we interviewed said, act fast, act early in a parliamentary term. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Basically look at the fact that we have tried to do this again and again and again, and we keep repeating this sort of, but that was the last government, so I'm going to start afresh. They basically don't reinvent the wheel, pick up the kind of the decades-long thinking that have gone on in this and just go with it, be bold. And I love, there's a quote from George Osborne about saying, what's the point of occupying number 11 Downing Street or indeed number 10 Downing Street if you're not going to do anything with it? And I think that is absolutely the sense of this, of going, it has to be, you have to own it. And the biggest challenge to politicians is the fact that a compelling argument, which is what this all comes down to, if you can frame it well and make the politics work, which you can through an amazing, compelling argument, that is a politician's superpower. That's their ultimate quality, is being able to make compelling arguments. So we kind of call on them to do that. And we start with a quote from Winston Churchill, who says that healthy citizens are the greatest asset any country can have. And it feels like that, as a compelling argument captured in one sentence, that is what we want to see more of. Amazing. I feel like such a good line. I feel like I should finish there. But I'm just going to, do you know one thing I did think, though, the bit of narrative that was swimming around all this that really relates to this is, I heard some people kind of on the inside of this who were saying, the main thing that's got to come out of it is no more pilots. Don't do pilots. So interesting. Just don't do pilots. That's as soon as you sign up to that and agree to that almost as a sort of semi-compromise because everyone's not quite sure, you're done. So it's got to be, even if it's better to work locally and do it all. Do it and show it and then prove it, and you might be quite a small sample, a region or whatever. That is a much better approach than we've got a pilot in every region and then and it stops totally. That is the story, sadly, of the last 30 years and probably much longer of policy making and repeating what they said. Just stop faffing around, get on and do it, and be bold and use this position. They fought to be in these positions, and literally, what is the point if you're not going to do something with it? Amazing. Listen, we're pretty much at the end of our time now, but that has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about it. And listen, enjoy your talking later. I hope it goes really well. Thank you. Enjoy the show. Thank you so much. Amazing.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Wellhub, the corporate wellness platform transforming how companies care for their teams with a single subscription. Get an exclusive free trial using the link in the description below.